You're listening to What It's Like with Luce, a podcast highlighting ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I'm your host Lucy Norris, and on today's episode, I'm chatting with Asia's youngest certified speaking professional. Following a childhood of intense bullying, this week's guest left behind a traditional career in accountancy for a lifetime of sharing stories to inspire others. Taking Singapore's corporate sector by storm, this individual is no stranger to a TEDx stage and has transformed the mindset of some of the continent's most influential business leaders with his words alone. Author, voice of the millennial generation, and self-confessed introvert, the speaker and coach knows how to make an impact and then some. Here's what it's like to be Benjamin Loh. Before we get stuck into the episode, I just wanted to say that if there is a drop in sound quality throughout, I'm very sorry. But in respect of social distancing during COVID-19, I've had to record episodes remotely. In this challenging time, we're all trying our best, so I really hope everyone is staying safe and that you enjoy the episode. Welcome, Benjamin. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today. I think it would be a good starting point if we discuss a little bit about what it was like for you growing up in Singapore.
So I think growing up in Singapore, and for those of your audience as well as listeners who may not have heard of Singapore or been to Singapore, I think Singapore is an island state in Southeast Asia and, of course, part of Asia. So if anyone has been to Singapore, if you've grown up in Singapore, I think Singapore is a really comfortable place to grow up in and basically, to sort of realize your dreams. So the typical Singaporean kid, I would say like a kid in Australia, in US, in London, and in Europe, I think the life is pretty much charted out from young, right? So both my parents definitely value education a lot. So they send me to schools. So it's junior school to secondary school to pre-university, university. So I would say for a good 18 years of my life, I've been schooled and I've been living in Singapore. Life was good. Life was really nothing for me to have anything to worry or be concerned about. But I think for me, what was really the thing that stuck up for me as a kid in Singapore was that I think the downside of being too comfortable while you're growing up as a kid in Singapore is that you tend to be conditioned and very, very much conforming to what the society expects of you. So I always would like meet friends from the other side of the world, like from United States. And I would ask them like, hey, we are of the same age, our parents are pretty much, similarly educated. But why is it that you and I look at the world so differently, right? Why do you see the world as an open playground, as a place where you celebrate your individualism, right? Whereas in Singapore, and I think, again, that's where the cultural norms, the construct are, I think as a Singaporean, I was never really taught to discover myself, right? The system by which I grew up in was really get good grades, go to school, get a sort of a reliable, safe enough kind of like degree to get a job, find a girlfriend, get married, get children, right? So I think the typical Singaporean rhetoric is just growing up like this. So I think one thing maybe fascinating was that when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, there was this like a Singaporean dream, just like the American dream. So in the Singaporean dream, there's what we call as 5 C's, right? So the first C is cash. If you have a lot of cash with you, you're successful, right? So there's cash, there's car. So if you drive an automobile, you're pretty much good to go. And in Singapore, cars are ridiculously expensive. There's a condominium, which is like an apartment. In Singapore, about 80 to 90% of people live in public housing. So if you're lucky 10 to 20% living in a private apartment, you're pretty not too bad. And then there's like credit card, as well as a credit card and a country club membership, right? So I think, again, Singaporeans are pragmatic. And amidst our our conditioning, everything being charted out, I think there's always downsides, right? So the downsides to being a Singaporean kid was that I was never really thought to express myself. I was never really thought to ask myself what my life can be and should be and will be. So those were the I would say the extremes of the different emotions. I was thankful, I was happy, and when I meet friends for example, from Vietnam, from Myanmar, they probably didn't even have money to go to school, I was thankful. But when I asked myself, how much more I could be, that was like a big black box. I didn't know what I could be, right? And that meant a certain kind of like a lot of fear, a lot of concern into sort of exploring what it meant to deviate away from my path.
And how did you deviate away from your path? Because I know that you kind of dabbled in accounting for a little bit, but obviously now you're, among many things, a public speaking coach and kind of the voice of millennials in Asia, I would say. So how did you go from feeling you were very confined in what was expected of you and what you were maybe allowed to do to the life that you live now?
Yeah, so I like to liken life as like a tapestry of like experiences as well, incidents and people that you meet. So for me, I have several backstories that sort of led me to do what I do today and to discover what I am sort of like experiencing today. So one backstory was that from 7 to 17 years old, I was a serial bully victim. So I grew up in a boys' school, and in fact, I studied in boys' school, and boys being boys, when there's no girls around, they show all their true colors. There's a lot of taunting, there's a lot of like challenging. And I grew up as a sort of a seriously overweight boy. So I was like close to 100 kg and I was really fat, chubby. And for me, a large part of my growing up years, especially my teenage years, was discovering my identity. So insofar as I was good in school, I was always like consistently in the top three in terms of academic positions. I never really knew what I was good in life, right? I was bad at music, I was bad in arts, I was bad at sports. And if I meet girls outside of my school circles, my legs would literally shake, right? So my teenage years was a lot of conflict, a lot of pain. And when I talk about being a serial bully victim, it was like a victim of physical bullying, verbal bullying, emotional bullying, and all the different names that were put onto me. So I think, again, I like to think that the pain and the trauma, the sorrow that we had is life's way of like teaching us and giving us an insight into ourselves, right? So a lot of people think that, when bad things happen to us, it's the end of life. But for me, call me an eternal optimist or something. When all those pain, the trauma, the bullies came to me, right, it sort of forced me to move inwards, right? Because all the pressures were all externalized, and the only way I could go was to go in, right? And I think in my growing up years, in the teenage years, I started to realize that, hey, one, I had certain gifts. And one of the gifts was that I was really, really introspective. I like to reflect. I like to sort of like take long walks home and then ask myself like, hey, how was my day like? What was that person thinking? How could I say something? And those were the latent gifts that I never really discovered I had, right? I didn't go for drama class. I didn't go for like creative writing. Lucy, you went for like a journalism program. I think all of that allowed you to express, right? So that part of my growing years, and then later studied accounting because it was a really, really practical and somewhat foolish decision. I realized that bankers could make like good money when they graduate. So I told my mom that, hey, maybe I should study accounting and finance. And say, yes, you should go ahead because my boss is the CFO in the company as well. So you got your certain blessing from your mom, and then you went to it. It was somewhat into the second year of my university when I realized that math and numbers just didn't work with me, right? So I recalled when I was in accounting class, I was doing my balance sheets and my cash flow statements. Everyone to my left and right were just like doing it so quickly. And then I would stare at the numbers and I would try to balance my balance sheet. And the whole point of balancing the balance sheet was that the numbers have to tie, right? Meaning to say, there's no missing sum. Every time I did that, it was always like missing 20 cents, 50 cents, $1. I thought I was retarded, right? I was like thinking like, why is like everyone doing so so easily, and I was like so slow at that. So one thing led to the other. The bully incident led me to realize that I had certain gifts, but where did I find that? And then I went to accounting school, all those started to, again, ask me to look inwards. I think my turning point came when I was 19 or 20 years old. I joined a life coaching program, and that really gave me a lot of insight into who I was and who I am and who I can be. And the coaching program gave me a lot of courage to pursue my own dreams and discover my voice. So we started to do certain projects. And my first project was actually to explore Toastmasters. So for those of you who are listening to this podcast, Toastmasters are really not two things. One is not like raising a toast and, making fancy toast. Toastmasters is really like a public speaking movement. And I realized that, hey, insofar that I was introverted, I was a bully victim, I actually love to express myself. I was better with words than numbers. I was better at putting thought into rhetoric and narratives and writing and speaking versus trying to like be structured and be very methodical with numbers and figures and data and statements. So I think one thing led to the other, and And those in my earlier 20, in my early 20s really planted the seeds to let me know that, hey, maybe I would have a better shot in life and a passion if I give myself a chance to work with people, to discover them and to express myself.
I think it's a really interesting contrast that you have when you say you're an introvert, but then you can stand up and you feel comfortable speaking to hundreds of people. So when you first started out, were you nervous to do that kind of thing, or was it an instant click of this is what I was meant to do?
Totally, right? So I think it was a journey of evolution. So insofar that, I think again, back to how I started, I was a bully victim, right? I still recall my first public speech at about 21 or 22 years old. I was running a youth organization back then, and we had a minister in Singapore to sort of like grace the ceremony. I had to give the opening speech as the president of the organization. So while I had my words, my scripts, my PowerPoint in front of me, I still recall that one speech because while I was like looking so confident on the onset and on the outside, I was choking with emotions inside. Yeah, and if I could recall, I think that speech really made me feel very sort of flushed with emotions because there were so many pairs of eyes looking at me. So there were remnants of my bullying past because, that was what I was really fearful about, when everyone's eyes were on me, and it made me feel like I was vulnerable, I was naked, I was like weak and defenseless. That public speaking moment just elevated all of that, right? So I think thankfully, after I started to work with a coach, I started to process all of those emotions to realize that, hey, all of those like inner demons sort of like haunted me, but they shouldn't like sort of hold me till the rest of my life. So I think one thing led to the other. Again, it started to get better, and to today, I think my introversion has not changed. I still recharge, find back my energy at the end of the day by reading a book, watching Netflix, right? Just like vegetating. I'm not the kind whereby I need to go to the club, hang out with friends till 2, 3 a.m. to get back energy. And I think, again, the last thing that I want to probably mention is that I feel introverted people actually make good public speakers, right? Because several points, right? One, I feel the best speakers or the better speakers actually are more introspective in nature, right? So they are able to bring in themselves and bring in a part of themselves into the subject matter at hand, right? So that introversion actually allows them to bring off the more, I would say, filtered thoughts, a lot more control in terms of your narrative. I think the second thing is a great speaker should really be comfortable with silence as well. And I think a large part of being an introvert is, we live in silence almost whenever we're not with people, right? So we're comfortable with silence, we're comfortable with pauses and stuff like that. And I think the third thing is, I think introversion, it's a very, very attractive but understated quality that allows people to really sort of like say, hey, you needn't be loud or flamboyant or colorful as a speaker. And there are people who obviously just have that kind of quiet charm as an introvert, right? So for various forms and elements of it, I think that, if you're an introvert out there, there's a lot to celebrate, in fact.
Obviously, you turned your newfound passion for public speaking and expressing yourself in that way into your current business. So can you kind of tell me a little bit about that process and what you remember from those days?
Yeah, so I started doing the work that I do since I was a freshman in my university years. And I started out in terms of speech and presentation coaching, which is still what I do to today. And it was like working with young adult youths in terms of like presenting school projects, being in front of class, trying to discover your voice, being humorous, how to handle like questions and answers. And I think that part of me sort of like was what my initial foundation years were. And it was all about sort of like being in front of the stage, comfortable with people. And I think that sort of laid the pieces in terms of what I do today. Today, I work with a corporate audience from Fortune 100 to Fortune 500 companies. I would do a variety of a few things. One is still speech and presentation coach. I'm a speech and presentation coach to mid to senior executives here in Singapore and Asia, in fact, where I train them to be effective as well as authentic when they have mission-critical speeches and speaking moments. The second thing I do is I go to different corporations to speak with them about millennials and future of young people. And I think a lot of times as a young person, I like to think I'm convincing enough because, right, you could have like people who have say, hey, I've been in P&G, I've been McKinsey, I've been BCG, I've worked with young people for 20, 30 years of my life. I know a bit of things about young people versus Ben here who says, hey, I'm a young person as well, and my friends are like 99% all young people. Let me tell you a bit about who they are, what they do, and what they want at a job. So I think that speech coaching training was giving me a lot of stand-up coaching experiences. And in the sort of the past 4 to 5 years, I started to go on the stage to tell a lot more stories. And what was a very comfortable segue was really talking about the very demographic that was closest to my heart, myself. And I think the biggest reason that sort of led me into the keynote speaking world was when I was actually coaching a senior executive here in Singapore, and that person started to ask me, Ben, why are you young people always so flittering, right? Like, why can't you stay on a job? Why are people leaving in 12 months? Like, no, their butts are not even warm on the chairs and the seats, and they're going for the next job. Why are they like coming at 9, after 10, and they're insisting that you leave at 5 and 6? Why are they this, and what makes them that, right? So I had a sort of a barrage of questions, and then I said, hey, maybe that was a calling. So I sort of like followed this calling to speak and train and write more stuff and produce more content. And I think that's how I sort of got a bit of foothold into this industry in this part of the world as well.
And how do you think you initially built your client base, or what was it about you as an individual and your company that made people really buy into it?
So that's an often asked enough question. I think for me and anyone who's out there planning to become a speaker, coach, where you're essentially selling two things, right? One, you're selling an intangible, which is your speech, your wisdom packaged into a process that hopefully will give them a positive and desirable outcome. So for example, as a speaking coach, my wisdom, my process would give them an outcome to say, hey, I'll be confident and be authentic. And when I go to different kind of speaking engagements, I can really, really perform and deliver, right? So that's the kind of thing, right? In terms of like speaking about millennials, hopefully my wisdom packaged into a speech or a training program or one-to-one work will give them the outcomes of being able to, hey, I understand that young person sitting at the corner part of the office, I can relate better to him or her. And if he or she replies to me LOL or this, or whatever the acronym that's trending right now, I sort of be able to relate to them in their wavelength. I know how to ask the right questions. I know how to go deeper in terms of conversations. So for me, I roughly had that general direction, but to say it was easy is definitely lying, right? So my initial years were very, very painful. I would sort of like, in fact, I think that's almost the undeniable and unavoidable journey of like most people starting out young. So when you're starting out young, you really have nothing to your name. You have no degree. My degree was in accountancy, for goodness sake, right? It wasn't even like in people management, if at least I had a people management degree, right? So it was in accounting. And I think for me, it was really putting my work out there. So using social media like LinkedIn, Facebook back then, I started building up my social presence as early as 12 years ago. So while my friends were in accounting school, like sort of like working on their resumes, their academic resumes, I was working on my real life resume. I was like publishing content, writing, interviewing people. I sort of published my first book at 27 years old, where I interviewed Asian CEOs on public speaking in Asia. So that was my way of like sort of building thought leadership in the spaces that I was in. And the earliest paid work, I recall my first speaking engagement was actually paid 50 Singapore dollars, which is about 25 euros for a full day of work. But if you deduct, the sort of the taxi travel to the place and taxi travel back, I was actually out of the pocket, meaning to say I actually made losses for my first gig. But the thing is, it gets better, right? So as with all things, once you do that first time with live audience, and that first gig was just training students on public speaking, it built up and gave me a bit of confidence to say, hey, now that I've done 1, can I do 1.1? Now that I've done 1.1, can I do 1.3? And then when I've done 1.9, can I go to 2.0, right? So it's an iterative process. And I think for me, once I started to build up more social presence, more success, more case studies, and I would invite my clients to say, hey, Mr. Client, Madam Client, if you felt that I've given you real value, and only if you felt so, could you leave a reference for me on LinkedIn? And I realized that, hey, as I started to build up my sort of social proof around what I've done for my clients and what they've experienced, the selling becomes easier. And these days when I meet any potential prospect, I would just say, hey, I've been in this work for 12 years, and although I look young and I am young, you can take a look at my LinkedIn and have a look at what I've done for my clients. If this sort of goes up your alley, let's talk and let's sign on the papers. If it doesn't, no problem. You should find someone that really works for you. So I have that ability to walk away. versus, at the start, it's really sort of like grabbing at each and every opportunity. But I would say each and every life stage of your business, you have unique set of challenges as well.
And then I guess I'm wondering, so you spoke in the beginning about how potentially confining not Asian culture, but maybe expectations are for young people growing up. How was the success you were having with, let's say, an alternative career impacting on maybe your personal life, what your friends and your family kind of thought? Did it have a negative effect, or were they supportive all the way?
I would say I'm pretty thankful and pretty blessed because any parent in Singapore and I would say Asia, I like to think they're pretty different from the US, right? Or in Europe. So for example, in US and Europe, the sort of the rituals of growing up is for you to leave your parents' place and sort of like get a place of your own, to be independent, right? So generally speaking, and I'm being very, very dangerous and making stereotypes down here, people and young people growing up in the West, independence is almost something that parents would want to expect of their children and what the children will want to yearn after, right? But in Singapore and Asia, right, do our parents want us to be independent? Yes, right? But we do not need to go to the extent of, like, for example, be fully independent in terms of our location, our houses, our jobs, blah, 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 so on and so forth, right? And I think definitely there was a pressure of like, one, studying an accounting degree, but not being a corporate person. I never worked in a corporation a single day in my life. But the irony is 95% of my clients are all corporation type of clients. So some way or the other, they found me legit and they found me to be credible and they found me to be someone that they could trust. So to your question, I think the pressures were real in that in several areas. Like one, societal expectations. I had an accounting friend who studied with me, graduated on 4th year, and she told me, why don't you go to an accounting firm and work for 4 more years and at least get a certified public accounting cert, which is a CPA. And at the back of my mind, I was saying, like, girl, I spent 4 years to get out of accounting school, and you want me to go to 4 more years of work just to get a piece of paper, right? So what's very, very unique in Singapore, or at least in Greater Asia, is this paper chase, right? We build our social as well as our intellectual security, but getting more certificates. These certificates are not just like amassing knowledge, but amassing a lot of like employment security. But for me, when I graduated from accounting school, the only reason why I graduated from accounting school was just to assure my mom that, hey, your son down here, insofar that he's going to be a speaking coach and a trainer and a public speaker, he is still going to give you that security, which is a piece of graduation cert. That's it. And I told my mom, that's my tacit agreement with you and my gentleman's agreement with you. If you let me do my stuff, I'll give you my cert, right? But my friend out there was saying, hey, maybe you should spend four more years to get the CPA, which I thought was like crazy and ridiculous. But I could understand, right? Because again, that's how we are being brought up, to have security. Like, what if my side gig doesn't work out? What if this speaking and coaching thing doesn't turn out the way? What if I would have to find a girlfriend back then? I have to marry her. I don't even have like money to buy an engagement ring. So this is how, like, I don't know. I don't know, like, children or people growing up in the West, do they think so much? In Asia, we're always thinking like many years ahead.
I'd also be interested to chat a little bit about the fact that you're the youngest, I hope I get this right, but associate certified coach. Sorry, can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I had 2 credentials. Like, the first credential was a coaching one. So I sort of clinched that when I was in 2013. I was one of the youngest associate certified coaches, ACC for short, in the coaching world, and it's sort of like credentialed by the International Coach Federation over in the United States. In this year, I secured a second credential, which stands for the Certified Speaking Professional, and that's for professional speakers. And what a CSP is really an accolade for the top 10% of speakers globally, and you have to have a production income of about 400,000, was it Aussie dollars or US dollars, for you to qualify, and there's a whole battery of like certification, accreditation tests, audits, and stuff like that. So I managed to apply for that in Q4 of last year, and I was notified that I was a CSP, and I was a youngest CSP in the whole of Asia. So I think a bit of background and context to that is the professional speaking, in fact, speaking, training, and coaching, right? is what we call service provisions at a very specialized level, right? So if you want to go to a corporation out there to say, hey, I want to be a coach to your leaders, right? They're going to ask you like, who are you? Like, what can you bring to the table? And what makes you qualified to work with this, right? So at like, to sort of be a trainer and coach and speaker, that's already like a certain bar that you have to climb. But to be a CSP means that you have to be a productive speaker, meaning to say you have to have a lot of gigs and a lot of work. And the context, at least in Asia, again, I don't know about US and Europe. In Asia, people still buy experience, right? People still buy white hair, especially so in any corporation. And I think it was a huge challenge for me starting to build this profession when I was in my early 20s. And in my industry, usually people who are succeeding and getting a decent income are at the youngest in their late 30s. If not, the norm is in the mid 40s to 50s. Because by then, you've been in corporate for like 10, 15, 20 years. You go out there and say, hey, I have an MBA from INSEAD, I have an MBA from Harvard, from Yale, from Princeton. I've been an executive director in different companies. You have that kind of gravitas, right? But for me, I had none of that, right? So I had to literally convince my clients that this dude is young, he's Asian, he has black hair and sometimes funky hair. What makes him remotely even qualified to speak to our leaders, right? So that was my trajectory and trying to prove and trying to make sense on stage as a speaker and downstage as a coach to different people. So yeah, so that was really the context and the backstory.
And I watched your TED talk as well that you gave on the power of storytelling, which for me as a journalist, I related to so much. And I thought it was so inspiring and insightful to other people that potentially don't I think the world doesn't realize the value and importance of storytelling behind pretty much everything you do, whether it's business or in personal life. But surely giving a TED talk must have been pretty high on a bucket list that you had as a speaker. So can you tell me how that kind of came about, and then also how you were feeling about it?
Yeah, so I've been a 2 times TEDx speaker, and I've been a 3 times TEDx speaking coach as well, because I've been a speaking and presentation coach. I think for TEDx and being on TEDx stage, it's always an honor. It's always a privilege, and it's always an opportunity to, as the TED movement is all about ideas worth spreading, right? So for me, I thought very, very long for my second recent speech, which I did in Malaysia last year. And it was for one of the universities there. It was all about the power of storytelling in the field of STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. And a lot of people think that, in the STEM fields, it's all about just numbers and codings and making sure that things miraculously work out in the whole grand scheme of science and engineering, right? But for me, I realized that there were a lot of times whereby sometimes stories transcend the mathematical equations, for the lack of better descriptive, right? There are times whereby stories just connect with people. So take, for example, I was coaching a group of scientists here in Singapore, and they were trying to sort of pitch their ideas for funding. And a lot of times, I think when scientists or anyone who's like a technical professional, they're sort of going out there with an ask in mind. They're asking for money, for time, for resources, for support. It's all about their projects, right? So if you put them with a microphone, with a PowerPoint deck, or a sort of like a clipboard or a chart, they can talk forever. But when you ask them to talk about, like, say, hey, what's your story behind you wanting to do this? Their tongues sometimes get tied. And it's as if, it's so detached, right? It's like my scientific, my engineering, my mathematical work is not me, right? I can talk about that, but I can't talk about me, right? And I realized that in so far as they would be able and comfortable to talk about stories about themselves, what led to their discovery, what led to their desire to even go into this field and this trajectory, how was it like to find that first moment of eureka, that sort of get them really, really excited. So it's not that they didn't have it all within themselves, it's just that they aren't used to it. So for me anyway, the TEDx speech was all about like, how do you leverage the power of storytelling to connect deeper with your different stakeholders, that when they hear your story, they hear and see and experience a lot of things that's not on your slides. They feel you, right? They get that you are not that average scientist out there who's just about publishing papers. And I say this not to offend anyone who's like a scientist out there to publish more papers and then go ahead and publish more papers, right? There are scientists but there are researchers who also care for the world. They care about people, right? They care about, like, for example, how does science affect not just our generation and upcoming generations. And I think if they do not learn or harness the power of storytelling, it's so much gem and sort of a lot of magic that's within that's not being communicated out there. And I think that's a waste.
It's such an interesting field to work in, I'd say, and it must feel so nice, or you must feel so accomplished when you can watch these people reach their potential in kind of connecting more on a human level with themselves before they connect with the audience, which I think is really cool. And so if you could go back to the very beginning of your career and when you started out on this, do you think there's anything you would do differently?
I think for me, it was very serendipitous in that I just went to the speaking career because I was really, really desperate. I was very, very upset in studying in accounting school. I couldn't get a change of my major, and I was almost deliberating. Like, I literally filled up this like paper to like sort of be terminate or suspend my studies, and I want to quit university altogether. I think a bit of rationality came over and say, hey, Ben, that wasn't the smartest or the wisest thing to do. And you're living in Singapore after all. So, I chunked that and I completed all of that. So if you ask me if there's anything I would do or do differently, I would say no. For me, I think, again, this is a question I ask my students as well. Sometimes when I'm on the interviewing side like you, Lucy, I will ask people that question as well. But again, I like to think that everything in life happens for a great reason, right? So every trauma, every setback, every sort of like a speech that bombed on you has a lesson for you. So, like, for example, this morning on my Facebook, I actually shared this a speech that I done in Macau 2 years ago in 2018. So although I'm a Chinese in Singapore, but my family doesn't speak Mandarin on a day-to-day basis. So after I studied about 16 years of Mandarin, I left it, I returned it all to my teachers, right? So besides just day-to-day ordering food, I didn't really speak Mandarin professionally, much less even on a work basis, because my clients were all from different parts of Asia, from US, from Europe. So then came 2 years ago, I had to deliver a speech to 800 people in Macau. It was my first speech ever, mass public speaking in Mandarin. After about 16 to 17 years old of not being on stage to string even a sentence in Mandarin, in proper Mandarin, because giving a speech is different from like going to the supermarket or in China, just say, hey, I want a drink, or how much is that? I definitely could say that. But, if you need to be coherent, you need to be intelligent, you need to make sense, it's a whole different ballgame altogether. So the long and short of it, I engaged a Mandarin coach, but I was still really, really nervous. In my first 12 years of speaking, I never had anything like that, right? So what really happened to me in Macau, for the 3 to 4 nights, I will wake up in the middle of night gasping for air. I would have nightmares of me bombing on stage and saying the wrong things and people just walking out on me during the speech. And on the actual day, my speech was around midday. I woke up at 4:30 a.m. and in the middle of the hotel room, I would like look in the mirror to practice. So what happened was that I bombed on my speech, and it was a terrible feeling. Mm-hmm. And I went into the lift, and I was at the back of the lift. I thought that was the worst, but the golden moment came. I had 2 delegates walk into the lift with me. I was at the back, they were at the front, and they were speaking in Chinese, and they said, hey, that speaker in the main hall was terrible. I couldn't even make out what he was trying to say, right? It was such a waste of time. And I guess they didn't know that I was all the way at the back of the lift, and I was the speaker that just spoke in the main hall, and that was the break moment, right? So chances are I was that speaker that he was, both of them were referring to. So that story totally hit me, and a part of me just like wanted to give up, right? Like why am I doing this? I mean, I'm a Chinese, yes, but why should I go into a whole different professional, divergence, right? I could stay the safe path as an accountant, but I diverged to become a speaking coach and a professional speaker. And I did that in English comfortably for 12 years. Business was thriving, but I diverged again to try out another different kind of arena. But anyway, what happened was that I managed to just continue like submerging myself in the Mandarin environment, listening to podcasts, reading more books. In the recent engagements that I did to the China and Hong Kong audience, finally they sent me like messages and totally warm warm my heart up, and they say, hey, like teacher Ben, like whatever you say was amazing. I love your humbleness. Do you have online classes? Do you have more ways that we can engage with you and learn from you? And I think if anything, I posted that post on Facebook to say that had I given up on myself after Macau, I probably have proven that two ladies right, that I was an absolute waste of their time, right? Insofar, I had bombed on that stage in 2018 in May in Macau. If I had given up, I would not have been able to deliver the impact that I'm delivering today, 2 years down the road. So I think, again, a lot of times we would look back in life and we would ruminate, we would reminisce and say, hey, life would be so much better if we did A and B and C. But again, I think every time and every sport of our life, right, we're sort of like reacting and performing under imperfect knowledge. Meaning to say we will never know everything, right? And if we actually did know everything, what's the meaning of life? It's like playing a computer game whereby, you had all the cheat codes in front of you and then you're going to be like winning each and every level. And that makes life meaningless, right? So I think for me, it's never about like sort of gaming the game of life. But obviously I want to win in the game of life. But to my best knowledge, under the imperfect kind of scenarios, I will still do what I do to the best I can.
I love that analogy with the video game. It's so true. If you had all the answers, where's the fun in it? And I think sometimes the best things come from failure because it really makes you realize, I guess, how much more you do want this to work out. But I'd also be interested to know what your driving force is and how you do, in that moment when you did just want to give up, what was it that made you continue?
I think the driving force for everyone is so subjective, but I think the driving force for me over the years have changed a lot. I think when I was in my early 20s, it was like to prove myself and to prove like people who look down on me, to prove them wrong, right? So I had this like vengeance in me, or this like this angry sense. I'm like angry, but I pretty much have masked it well. People think I'm very mild, but inside of me I had a lot of angst, right? So I recall because in Singapore, we have to do national service, which is 2 years of military service. I recall in my first few years of doing this speaking thing, I actually met a friend who used to serve national service with me. And we met at a bus stop and he said like, Ben, so you're trying to do that freelance speaking thing, yeah? How's that coming along? So he had a kind of condescending tone, and obviously at the starting point of my work, I didn't have much to say to him. I said, yeah, it's pretty fine. And I think it's going to be working out, right? So that was my 20s trying to prove. And towards my later part of my 20s, I sort of gotten somewhere and I sort of like achieved different kind of like results, including the CSP, being the youngest sort of certified speaking professional in whole of Asia. I started at work coming in. I started with clients like sort of saying, hey, are you available to speak? What do you speak on? Can you speak for us? And I think for me, in my 30s, the driving force is very, very much different, right? I feel that in contrast to my early 20s was like proving people wrong, proving myself right, trying to discover myself. I think my 30s is really about consolidation. And I think every day I will wake up with this like voice in mind which says, Ben, how can you serve the people who are entrusting so much of their lives and their work with you, and how can you serve them even better, right? So that gives me this energy because I think service is an attribute that goes very, very deep. Right? It's like, for example, we go to a church, that's service, right? We go to military, that's service. Even like, for example, people at the fast food restaurants, McDonald's, cafe, there is a difference between people who are just doing it for the job and people who are out there trying to delight you, to serve you. And I think like service is such a powerful kind of like intention as well as emotion, where service is not about you. And service, I like to think, is all about putting the other stakeholders or the other person in the middle of your heart and in the middle of your life. And for me, when I sort of started to ask like, how do I serve my clients better? How could I serve my wife better? How could I serve my mentors better? And now as I run a company with employees as well, I start to ask myself, how can I serve them better? Right? How can I make their work better? It just sort of orientates you to shift and to act in the interest of other people. So I think it's a strange turn of event. Like, in my 20s, it's all about myself. Now in my 30s, it's really realizing that, hey, who can I serve best? And how can I serve them? So to answer your question, I think in terms of driving factor, it's definitely still about me. Don't get me wrong. I'm not that selfless. I'm not that altruistic. It still has to hit back to me. But I think where I'm starting from is really asking like myself, I've been really, really blessed in abundance. And there are people who give me a lot of opportunities. And that's why I could do the work that I do as a early 30 something, right? But when I start to orientate myself to not think of myself first, but to think of others first, then everything starts to make sense and comes back one way or the other.
Do you have a personal definition of what success is for you?
I don't have like a strict definition per se, but I like to think of like myself succeeding is when I sort of ask, when I benchmark myself of today with the Ben of yesterday, I would ask myself like a few questions. Right? The first question I'll ask would be, have I stretched myself in more ways than one? For example, have I stretched myself intellectually, emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually? Right? So that's one. Second question that I would ask myself would be, have I paid gratitude to people who have sort of like given me an abundance? So whether are mentors, whether are sponsors, whether are people who go all the way out just to make things happen for me. Have I actually said a thank you to them? Have I picked up the phone and give them a call, right? The third thing would be, I'll ask myself, have I actually made someone's life better as a result of what I know or what I have? So if the questions to the answers to this question is consistently yes and yes and yes, I think I'm succeeding on an everyday basis, right? And then what does succeeding on a big life basis mean? I think, again, I could go down that philosophical route, which I'll try to avoid. But for me, the whole notions of success, I like to think my whole life success is not yet defined. But I do have like sort of rough markers, which is I need to be having a comfortable base to take care of myself and my family. But I really want to have ripples and ripples of impact and effect on other people. And the reason why I become a coach and a trainer as well as speaker is that it is one of the best ways to scale your impact. So for me, I think this work feeds me. And if I could do it, I could do this work over and over again and on a deeper basis to serve more people. I think that would be like sort of my life success.
No, I like that. That's a really nice idea, that so much of your success you get from helping other people. I think that that's a really positive space to live in. And then just my last question for you before I let you get on with your evening. If I put your 10-year-old self in front of you now, from having been through everything you've been through and everything you've learned, what's the biggest piece of advice you would give your 10-year-old self moving forward in life?
The 10 years old Ben was someone who had dreams, but not very big dreams. He was fearful of people. He was growing up and was trying to figure out like who he was, like every other 10-year-old kid out there. But I think what was unique about this like 10-year-old Ben was that he was also very deeply loved by his grandma, his parents, his sisters, his family, but he just didn't love himself enough. Right? So for me, if I could, as a 32 years old person talking to my 10 years old self, I would really tell him that if you only love yourself a bit more, your life would just blossom. And you have it all in you to be a person of significance, to be a person of impact, and to be a person that would really mean a lot to many, many people in the many, many years to come. Only if you start to love yourself, only if you start to accept yourself, and only if you start to celebrate yourself. And I think, again, maybe that's the only thing I would change, right? I wouldn't change anything on the outside, but if on the inside I could have a bit more tenderness, a bit more love, a bit more acceptance in and with myself when I was like 10 years old, I think I would be a very, very, very amazing kid.
I love that, because I think that's so prevalent now more than ever, especially with, you know, kids growing up in the era of social media. I hear so many people say, God, I would hate to be a kid these days, because there's so much external pressure and so many more obstacles that you'll face that will try and make you feel less of a person, I guess. I don't know. But so, yeah, I think that piece of advice will resonate across the board for everyone.
I totally agree that this whole like social media thing, while it's a platform, a tool for us to get connected, you know, we just like to show the best selves on social media. And I think, again, sometimes when you're growing up, I think a lot of children growing out there, they may not realize that for every sort of shiny example you see out there, they could be, if not more, insecure than you are. They could be, if not more, uncertain than you are. They could be, and if not more, unaware about who they are and what their life could be than you are. And it's just that this whole social media thing with all the likes and shares and comments are feeding them and feeding their ego.
Thank you so much for listening, and as always, please rate, share, and leave a comment if you like what you hear. And don't forget to follow @WhatIt'sLikePod on Instagram and Facebook. For more information on Benjamin's work and writings, visit the links provided in the show notes. I'll be back next week with more inspiring stories, but for now, this has been What It's Like with Luce.